Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Patricia Moore Shaffer, representing the National Endowment for the Arts Office of Research and Analysis. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on evidence at the core of the 21st century local arts agency. This is the second in a series of webinars showcasing evaluation and performance measurement strategies in the arts. Today's webinar will explore how local arts agencies are increasingly using evaluation and performance metrics to hold themselves accountable to the communities they serve. During today's webinar, you can listen on your computer or also dial in at 1-877-685-5350 with passcode 870335. This number will also be provided in the chat box of this webinar. Please note that the web meeting will be limited to the first 125 attendees. However, up to 300 can listen on the phone. Also during today's webinar, all participant lines will be muted. An archive of this webinar will be made available shortly after the meeting. So here's a brief look ahead at what to expect during today's webinar. Following our guest speaker presentations, we will have the opportunity for questions and discussion. However, we encourage you to use the question box to submit questions in advance that the presenters can address during the Q&A session. If you're looking for the Q&A box, you should see it on the top of your screen towards the right-hand corner. And again, we encourage you at any time to submit questions during the presentation. So here's a brief introduction to today's speakers, along with our images so that you can see us, even in this format. Our first speaker today, Karen Gahl-Mills, is the CEO and Executive Director of Cuyahoga Arts and Culture, the local public funder of arts and culture activities in Cleveland, Ohio. She leads the team that has invested more than $158 million into over 350 arts and culture organizations and artists serving millions of area residents. A former orchestra manager turned grant maker and teacher, she has worked passionately through her 25-year career to connect the talents of arts and culture organizations with the needs of the community. She holds a Bachelor of Music degree from DePaul University and an MBA from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. She teaches graduate students in cultural policy at the University of Chicago and fundraising at Indiana University. And to her credit, she still makes music, singing regularly in the community choir at Oberlin College. Our second speaker today, Robert Bush, is the president of the Arts and Science Council of Charlotte-Mecklenburg. He is responsible for ensuring the Council's mission, annual goals, and long-term objectives by setting the strategy and vision for the organization, as well as the tone for an organizational culture that supports the Council's mission, goals, and strategies. During his long career in the arts, he has led several local arts agencies and also served on boards of both state and national organizations. A native of Hickory, North Carolina, he holds a bachelor's and master's in education administration and supervision with a concentration in community education from Appalachian State. He is also a graduate of the Managing the Arts program at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Robert currently serves on the faculty of the MPA program at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. And I'd also like to call out my NEA colleague today, Lara Holman-Garitano, who's sitting beside me, our local arts agency specialist, who was instrumental in shaping today's program. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm pleased to call upon Karen Gahl-Mills to offer today's first presentation. Karen, you have been made presenter.
There we go, mute off. It took a moment. Thank you very much, Patricia, and to everyone for joining today's conversation. I'm delighted to be able to talk about the way we use evidence to support our work here in Cleveland and Cuyahoga County. And I'm extra delighted to have an opportunity to work with Robert Bush, who is one of my favorite local arts agency managers in the field. So what I'm hoping to do today is to give you a sense of the kinds of ways we use evidence to support our work. Oftentimes they're more qualitative approaches, so you'll get some different things on this webinar about qualitative versus quantitative approaches to collecting and using evidence. And hopefully, as you're listening, depending on what size organization you work with, you'll hear some strategies and some ways to go about collecting this evidence that would be applicable no matter how large your organization is. And you'll get some reinforcement that resident feedback and a deep connection to the community is really critical for local arts agencies, particularly us, as we are a public entity, and I'll talk more about that here in just a moment. So what I'm going to try to cover today, we'll set the stage with some basics about what Cuyahoga Arts and Culture is, and then I'll talk about two basic ways that we are using and dealing with evidence that helps us make decisions. One is through our grant-making focus, and that's the demonstrating public benefit piece that you see here. And we'll talk about the internal and the external ways that we do that. And then I'll also talk very specifically about our engagement with residents and some work that we've done over the past year to directly talk with residents about where they are and how we use that information to craft strategy and craft grant making as we move forward. And that will take us then to talking about what comes next. So first, a little bit about Cuyahoga Arts and Culture. Cuyahoga is the name of the Crooked River that runs through our city, and it is a county of about 1.2 million people, and the city of Cleveland is about 400,000 people, to ground any of you who have not been here. Cuyahoga Arts and Culture is a political subdivision of our state, so that means we're a government agency. We're not a nonprofit organization. And we benefit here in Cleveland from a dedicated tax resource. Like many communities in the country, we have voted ourselves a tax. In our case, we tax cigarettes, and we use the proceeds of that to support arts and cultural activity at all levels throughout the community. I apologize, my slides are automatically advancing a little bit here, so if we go back and forth, you'll know that I'm just trying to catch up with what I'm saying and what you're seeing. Our agency was built in 2007 after a levy campaign in 2006 finally got this tax on the ballot and voters approved it. It was renewed in 2015. And we have a staff of 9 when we're fully staffed and a board of 5 that's appointed by our county executive. So one way we use evidence you can see right here. And this is a page from our annual report. I'd invite you to visit cacgrants.org, and you can find this report there in all of its detail. But what you'll see there is a set of stats across the bottom. 60.5 million people served, 54% of attendance at events were free events, $158 million investment over the past 10 years, et cetera, et cetera. That evidence comes directly from the Cultural Data Project. I don't know how many of you use that resource. We've been with the Cultural Data Project since its beginning and since our beginning. And it gives us one way to collect and count very important data points that we use with external resources to try to give folks a sense of the scope and the scale of the work that we do here as part of our evidence for external audiences. What you see then on this slide gets to the beginning of our conversation about the evidence, the first set of evidence we collect, which is around public benefit, how folks connect their work and the work of organizations to our community. And you'll see here our mission, our vision, and our values, and you'll find that on our website as well. But I need to explain that in 2011, we shifted our mission. As a public entity, I joined this organization in 2010. As a public entity, our board challenged us to think beyond just serving organizations by making grants to them, and also thinking about how those grants help to make our community stronger. Money, after all, is a means to an end, right? So what are we doing to ensure that the money that we're spending is making a difference for our community? And so our mission shifted to include the community at its core, and when we did that, it meant for us that we had to make some shifts in all of the work that we do. We do have 2 key stakeholder groups. We try to remember them all the time. It isn't just the organizations that we fund, but it's also the residents of our community. And when you shift your focus from simply funding organizations to thinking of yourself as a community resource, then you need evidence to collect and use that goes beyond simply, did you spend our grant money wisely? You need to begin to think about the evidence of how does the public benefit from the work that you do. And so that shift in mission statement, which seems very simple, it's a couple of words on a piece of paper, but that shift really did allow us to begin to think differently about the evidence we were collecting, the kinds of questions we were asking, and the work that we were doing. So how does that public benefit stuff work in practice? Well, this next slide is my nod to my Star Trek friends. Anyone who cares about Star Trek or watched it ever knows there was this thing called the Prime Directive, right? It was the idea being that there was some core principle that held the universe together. And so for us, this Prime Directive directly relates to our mission and directly relates to this idea that our grant programs have to be aligned around the benefits that accrue to the public. That's easy to say. So how does that play out in our grant-making practice, in our internal work? Well, in a couple of different ways. Certainly, it plays out in our application and in our criteria, and what you see here, and the URLs at the bottom, you can click through and find copies of all of our guidelines and all of this stuff on our website. We are very specific in asking, yes, we're going to ask organizations to tell us about the artists who do the work and the vibrancy of that work. Yes, we're going to ask organizations to tell us about their organizational capacity. But the biggest thing in our application process, the most important thing to us, is to have organizations tell us about the public benefit that they receive. And you see how we ask that question here. We ask organizations to define their community. We ask organizations to define the ways that they work with their community. We ask them to be very specific and give examples about what community means to them and how they do that work. That's through our grant application. It's mirrored in our criteria. Our grant panelists who come together, and some of you listening, I'm imagining, have been panelists for us. Thank you. Our grant panelists are charged with knowing that here in Cleveland, we don't talk about artistic excellence. We expect it. But what we expect most of all is for organizations to talk about the public benefits of their work, how they connect their work to the community in a meaningful way. And then that plays through in all of the reporting that organizations do for us as well. So this gives you the examples of what we ask. And this is the really big internal work of beginning to look for evidence of public benefit as a way to decide who's going to get a grant and who's not going to get a grant. So if that's some of our internal work of collecting that evidence, what's the external work that we use? This map here is a reflection simply of the places where programs take place during the course. This is the course of 2016. So you see the inside of Ohio on the left and where Cuyahoga County is. We're located on Lake Erie. It's beautiful. You should come visit us. But you see all the dots there. Those dots reflect where programs take place. Now, those dots do not simply reflect where organizations are headquartered. And that very simple distinction is something that was critically important for us, particularly when it came time to renew our levy in 2015. We needed geographic evidence to provide, not just the evidence we can collect from the CDP that talks about the numbers of organizations served, the number of people who participate in programs, the number of after-school programs and educational pieces. All of that data is very important. But as a geographically based funder, we also needed geographic evidence that the work that we do connected to residents throughout our county. Probably very similar to where you live. We have a city center, and when you look at where those dots are clustered, that's essentially the city of Cleveland toward the center of the map. But we have 58 other communities that surround Cleveland itself, suburbs, inner ring with issues and challenges around poverty and hunger, outer ring that have more wealth and more prosperity, but the further away you get from Cleveland, the less you seem connected to some of Cleveland's issues and priorities. So we had to find a way to demonstrate to those mayors at the bottom of the map, that where you see the dots get a little more sparse, we had to be able to convince them that this public benefit work that organizations were doing mattered to them. So we simply started collecting the information. And when I said at the start that I hoped that organizations of all sizes could hear themselves in my presentation, you know how we did this? We created a spreadsheet. It's nothing fancy. Our director of administration had the idea that we should be collecting data on where programs took place. We created a simple spreadsheet. We attached it to the report that organizations come back to us with, either twice a year if they get operating support, or at the end of their project if they get project support. And they tell us by street address where things take place. And we also measure, is it taking place in a school or not in a school? And that simple spreadsheet, when you bring it to your friends at a university who have some GIS mapping software, and there are lots of other ways to do this now, allows us then to provide this geographic evidence of what did we do and how did we do it. again, this doesn't have to be complicated, but this document is the evidence that I probably use most of all as sort of the chief advocate for our organization in the community, particularly with elected officials, to show them and help them understand that we do reach not just the millions of residents of our community, but programs are taking place in all of those places in our community. So if public benefit is our prime directive, and we've been at this work, we made that mission shift in 2011, so we've been at that work for about 6 years. What are we learning from having a focus on public benefit and using public benefit as something that influences us when we're making decisions? Well, we're learning a couple of things, and this will not sound surprising to many of you, particularly those local arch agencies who are also grant makers. One of the things we learned when we started asking people to define their community and talk about who they were trying to serve is it was easier for organizations to talk about their audience. It was harder for them to talk about their community. When we asked them to tell us about how they engaged their audience in their work, it was easier for them to tell us how they marketed to their audience. It was less easy for them to tell us how they engaged things. And it was hard for our panels then to make good judgments based on the information we were collecting, the stories people were telling, and the work that people were doing. The struggle is real, right? Shifting away from talking about artistic excellence, which I know is so very important to the National Endowment for the Arts, and it's important to us too, but in a different way. It wasn't our primary focus. It became difficult for organizations to figure out how to navigate that work. And so we brought in some experts, and if you know Holly Sidford of the Helicon Collaborative in Brooklyn and Nick Rabkin of Remaking Culture in Chicago, these two had worked together years ago and were so happy to come back to work with us. And we asked them to look for more evidence. In 2013 and toward the beginning of 2014, they were here in Cleveland collecting evidence from cultural organization leaders, from focus groups of audiences, of board members, of key stakeholders, and trying to get a sense and get our minds wrapped around this question of what does public benefit look like for organizations, and why were folks having such a challenge in trying to talk about some of this work. I would encourage you to take a look at this white paper. Again, the URL is here. It's about 10 pages long, so it's not a hugely long read. What you will find in their report is probably not surprising. One of the things that becomes difficult for organizations, and I will blame myself as a grant maker here for some of this difficulty. Oftentimes, when you're writing a grant application, you are simply trying to respond to what a grant maker is asking. And what they ask you changes on a regular basis, right? Today, we're wanting you to talk about diversity. Tomorrow, we want you to talk about equity, right? Who's heard that story before? Folks were assuming that we were asking about public benefit in a way that was the flavor of the month, as opposed to really digging deep and having Nick and Holly help extract for us the idea that the public benefit, the way the public benefits from arts and culture is not static, because the public's not static, right? The people change. And in order to truly provide benefits to the public, it's not a question of marketing your work more effectively, as this pull-out quote says. It requires a shift in thinking for organizations, getting organizations to think about their role in their community, to think about the way they connect with their community in a fundamental way. And it was important for us to publish this information so organizations would have a better sense of how this would work, but it was also critically important in their findings that they suggested to CAC that while we had a pretty good handle on how organizations and their audiences were relating to arts and culture, we were missing that key stakeholder group on the right, the residents of our community. And so it was going to become important for us to do some additional evidence gathering around the residents of our community. We're very specific with that resident word, by the way. We don't say citizens, we say residents. In our current climate, we find that that's a word that resonates better with folks. So that led us to our Community Voices and Vision project, which you will find also on our website at future.cacgrants.org, where we decided to have a very clear methodology for how we would listen to the community. We had to move beyond an online survey, though that's a great tool and a great place to start. And we designed a survey that went to thousands upon thousands of people that asked questions not about the kind of art that people liked, but about what they like to do, where they like to do it, what they wanted to do more of, and who they did their who they worked with, who they participated in, whatever activities they like to do, who came along. We were very clear, though, in realizing in a community like Cuyahoga County, and particularly in a city like Cleveland, which has very high poverty that is generational, not everybody's online. And if we wanted to get beyond the usual suspects who would answer a survey related to arts and culture, we were going to need a clear methodology for reaching residents who might not be connected online. Our animating question for this work was, how can we best support the cultural lives of the residents of our community, both now and in the future? And what we learned was, in order to do that, not scientifically, but certainly with a methodology, we needed to go to the community to do the work. We had a street team of 25 volunteers who spent the summer taking that survey that we described in a simpler form on a clipboard, as you'll see in that photograph to the right, taking it to arts events, to the right-of-way outside a baseball game, to the farmer's market, to pretty much anything place where people gathered, and asking questions about what you do, who you do it with, what you want to do more of, etc. We also did a series of targeted listening sessions in community locations throughout our county that allowed us to get into the suburbs, in libraries, and other kinds of public places. And when I say that we cared about the methodology, demography really mattered to us as we were collecting this evidence. And what you'll see here is on the left column, it gives you a sense of the demography of Cuyahoga County. And on the right column, you'll see how deliberate we were in ensuring that our survey respondents, to the best of our ability, were able to reflect our community. We came pretty close. We missed some of the under 25s. But other than that, I'd say that we did a pretty decent job of really getting a representative sample of our community. So what evidence did we take from this simple methodology of collecting information? Well, two things that were critically important that are not on this slide. One was, as people responded to our survey and to our in-person intercepts, they told us that funding a variety of cultural institutions and activities, like we're doing now, is important and that we should continue, which is also terrific. We're glad to hear that from our public. But we heard something else that is critically important that we need to consider and that I think all local arts agencies are wrestling with right now. When we looked at the data from those who self-identified as a person of color or from a low-income community, what we heard was that those particular people told us, as much as they love the arts, they didn't feel they had access to them. Now, access can mean lack of transportation, lack of ability to buy a ticket. In some cases, it also meant, I don't feel comfortable in cultural institutions. I don't feel that they're for me, and I want you to fund things that are for me in my neighborhood, in my place. That was important for us to hear, and that suggested to us a path that also includes a second tenet around equity, around making sure that we are equitably supporting organizations as we move forward. So to get at to how we were going to do that equity question, I just wanted to give you a little bit of what's next, because that evidence around equity is deep. There's a lot there. I encourage you to look at future.cacgrants.org to better understand what we did, who we talked to. All of the evidence is there. Some more reports authored by Nick and Holly are there as well. And it suggested a path forward that I'll just touch on here quickly as I'm drawing to a close. And the first is for us, on our step on this equity journey is to claim equity as a value. We find that that's really important, and claim that racial equity is where we want to start. The second is about a different kind of evidence collecting. We have some learning to do as a board and a staff, and so we're participating in trainings and webinars and all of those kind of things. And the third piece is about reviewing policies and procedures, ensuring that when we look at the way we do our budgeting, the way we allocate our money, the way we hire, the way we use vendors, the way we select panelists, the application language that we use, getting people to self-identify around gender and race and all of those questions, is as inclusive as it can possibly be. The fourth little arrow here is also about talking with cultural organizations and understanding what they are doing. Holly Sidford wrote a report that talked about the bright spots in arts and culture, and so we're listening for bright spots. Who's doing this work well, and how do we collect evidence from them that will then take us to the phase of designing and testing what support for equity can also look like as we move forward. It is a journey. It is not something that will be done quickly, but the evidence that we've collected throughout this entire journey I've described today will help us get there in a meaningful way. So I hope what you heard there was you can collect evidence in lots of ways. It doesn't have to be quantitative. There are simple ways to do it. There are some strategies. Think about that simple spreadsheet about where that will allow you to do that and be able to make a difference. And I hope you will also take away what we have taken away, which is our commitment to this evidence gathering and to getting feedback from our community absolutely makes us a better and stronger organization, and it helps us do our work better. So with that, I'm going to sign off. I will peek into the Q&A box, and if there are some general questions there, I will try to answer them. And I will turn it over to my colleague, Robert Bush.
Good afternoon. I promise you that Karen and I have spoken, but we haven't spoken enough that you're gonna think we plotted, because a lot of what she just said, you're gonna hear recurring themes in the work that ASC has done. The Arts and Science Council, which I'll refer to as ASC, has been around for a very long time. We are a 501c3. However, we are designated by both the city and the county here as their local arts agency, and all of the public funds that they provide for arts and culture flow through the Arts and Science Council, including the public art program for the city and the county. We also raise private funds and receive state funds, and we distribute those through a multitude of grant programs, both for organizations, for projects for individual artists, and for educational efforts in the community. We also run a fairly significant capacity building program. So I'm going to talk about a little different things. I'm going to first give an overview of the research that ASC does. Then I'm going to go and show you one specific one which is unique to us, the Cultural Life Survey. We then will shift to how we have used research to design a program called Culture Blocks. And then we'll finish up with a brand new dashboard that we have finally worked on for a very long time, and it finally released. It actually came out on September 15th, which is the first sector scorecard for the arts and cultural sector here in the community, that are the evidence that our board has decided are the ones that actually tell the community if we are doing the job that ASC and the cultural sector has been charged with doing. So first on research, we probably like many of you, we do different kinds of things. Some are things that we do internally. Some are things that we do with our partners. So for example, I'm sure that many of you have just finished the Arts and Economic Prosperity 5 study with Americans for the Arts. We have been a partner in that program. We've just completed the 4th time that we have done that. We also do the LAA census with Americans for the Arts and other sort of surveying that they do, and we use that data in many ways, including their private sector giving, because we do raise funds. Cultural Life in Mecklenburg County is a different piece. That's actually a local survey that we do. We've done it annually since 2004. In 2003, we actually put our toe in the water by adding some questions about arts and culture to the Mecklenburg County government's resident survey that they do with the Urban Institute every year. But we have found that we spend about $20,000 a year doing this survey. And that sounds like a lot of money, but the information we receive is quite extraordinary, and you're going to see a lot of the answers to questions that we ask in that survey are reflected in the new dashboard key performance indicators. It's a valid, statistically sound survey, 400 phone calls in the market, in the county. Half are done by cell phone and half by landline. We also provide Spanish language speakers to make sure that we have that capacity in our effort, and we continue to improve that. We're actually looking now at, because we have been doing the study for so long and have such trend lines on a lot of the questions of, is there a way for us to now alternate the quantitative through the public opinion polling through fund survey with focus groups to provide more qualitative information and going deeper, working with the Urban Institute and I would encourage you to reach out to colleges and universities that serve your community. Many of them have the capacity for public opinion polling, and it's very much an economical thing to do. We also participate in West Staff's Creative Vitality Index, or Fiat Creative Vitality Suite. That's a small fee that we pay each year. We are just launching a new project called Culture Segments, the Audience Atlas piece of that. This is a new market research program that we're going to do for the entire 16-county region that will do psychographic profiling of the market and tell us what kinds of promotional and marketing messaging and types of messaging, video, print, visual, key messages are the ones that speak to the key segments of the market. And we'll be sharing the results of that, like we do with all of our research, with our groups that we write grant funds to, or cultural groups in the community that just are interested. We're also in the process of exploring building a shared database that would be a cloud-based platform for all of the groups to be able to house all of their transactional data, ticket sales, contributions, memberships, etc., and be able to do analysis across the entire platform for trends, looking for where groups that have similar audiences or have opportunities to partner and to extend their audience market. So it's that's something that's in process, and we hope to have a clear answer about by the end of December. But first, let's look at the cultural life in Mecklenburg County. So I'm going to give you some highlights of this past year's study that was completed in the spring of this year. In the sort of art, science, and history contribute to our quality of life and economic prosperity. You can see here that 77% of the respondents feel that the art, science, and history contribute to our quality of life. 78% think that it makes it a more attractive place for individuals and businesses to locate. You're seeing, nice increases there, 8% increase over last year in one, and a 7% increase since 2016, but it's been very steady for that year before that. We also, a fairly new question we added in 2015, 67% believe that individual artists contribute to the community's economic prosperity. These are new. We're trying to build stronger messaging here for not just the public sector, but the private business sector, and so that we can better answer their questions about our value to the community. On program quality, again, some interesting results. We added a few new questions because of this new scorecard that you're going to see in a few minutes. One around program availability. We wanted to see were the people satisfied with the variety of programming availability. 88% yes. You can see there were they satisfied with the availability near their home, so 87%. Did they consider the programming area somewhat innovative? Again, 58% lower. One of the things we've had to remind ourselves throughout this process as we worked on this dashboard is we don't want 100% on everything. We need to have some goals of where we can see that we're working and achieving better numbers over a period of years. Public art is seen as a major part of the city's identity, 81%. 62% feel that the programming reflects the diversity of the community. That's a very important tool for us, not unlike what Karen spoke about in the Cuyahoga County area. And then finally, 65% rate the quality of the programs as good or excellent. Attendance, we track that in the survey as well. 2 to 5 times a year is the majority number of times that people attend. But you can also see on this chart that there are probably around 3 to 5% of the audience go 26 plus times, and about 10% go 11 to 25 times. So that sort of shows that range of from one time, which is about, a little maybe 15%, up to the 26 plus times a year. There's a wide range, but that 2 to 5 times becomes the predominant sort of times that people are taking advantage of programs. We also look at barriers to participation, which is, you'll see this gets reflected in the final new scorecard, and it's become an increasing conversation for our board of directors about how are we serving the community. Looking down this list, of course, too busy, I think that we all could answer that question, that we're too busy to do that's a big barrier to attending things. But then you start seeing that even more than the cost of admission, traffic distance and parking is a critical barrier for their participation. We also feel that there has, if you go down to the third from the bottom, access to public transportation, that right at 30% that is a barrier, that actually is aligned in some ways with the number 2. So it could be that eventually those are seen together, but we're keeping them apart as we're trying to understand this better. Cost, location, not knowing what there is to do, they're having children or family. But then you still have about a third of the audience that says they're not interested. And then down at the bottom, poor quality of programs. We're hoping that keeps dropping, which is a good indicator that it's dropping. We also ask questions about cultural education and STEM. And you can see the 3 lines here. We like these ones that have these very strong year after year after year high percentages, that 81% say that cultural education is important to their children doing better in other academic subjects. 78% say that it's important for their children to do better with STEM programs. And 83% say that art, science, history are important to the education of their child. So we find that very helpful as we speak to the school system here and other advocates in the area of cultural education. We also find that we have very strong support for public funding through this program. You can see the numbers there, 78% for program support of government support of programs, 70% for the public art program, 72% for government support of facilities. These have been steady since 2000. That one's been steady since 2011, but we've seen some big increases since the 2012, 2013. 10 points up on government support of programs, 13 points up on public art. I think a lot of that has to do with the economy becoming more stable. As we were coming out of the recession, we saw those dip. But clearly, public support of the government supporting arts and culture is very strong. So how do we use some of this data? So Culture Blocks is a program plan that we have created that is specifically built on collection of data. And the data that we collected was a set of data on how connected neighborhoods were to the major cultural institutions. And we did that by a shared database effort that we had tried earlier that collected all of the transactional data from the partners, and then we could look at what zip codes were least and most connected to each of the major cultural institutions, the art museum, symphony, opera, science museum, ballet, theater companies, etc. This program, though, was built to respond to that data, and we have learned a lot. First, that sometimes listening is the best thing you can do as you're doing this kind of work. It's really about building relationships with specific areas, many of which are filled with individuals that are of a more difficult socioeconomic situation, and there's a higher rate of diversity in the population as well. But we also find that vibrant programming is where people can meet, and we're using libraries and recreation centers to do this work. And we're seeing that the public sector is increasing funding. So the county has increased from $0 3 years ago to, starting July 1st of this year, $675,000 to fund this program. So if you look at, this is a map of Mecklenburg County, and the very lightest areas shown, the little block, the census blocks that are shown there, those are the lightest ones are where the least participation with the major cultural institutions take place. The darker, and as you get to even the dark blue, is the most participation. And that wedge at the bottom that almost looks like a slice of a pie is the most affluent part of the community. It is where the wealthy live, and of course they are a key part of the audience of many of the cultural institutions that we were looking at in this data, so you would expect that that would be the highest participation. But if you take that map where we show the low participation rate, and then you go to the map and we now have started adding these specific blocks. This shows 6 of the blocks. We're actually adding a 7th block this year, but it's not quite defined yet. It's it's south of the ones you see here, but we'll have 7 blocks in operation by the end of this fiscal year. But this is what we worked in last year. But what happens with these blocks is that we go into these communities and begin with conversations with organizations. We do community dinners. We do a facilitated conversation. It's interesting that our board of directors frequently will say, oh, these people, you can't use the word culture. They don't know what the word culture will, they're going to think that that's a different connotation than we do. And culture's got a lot of bad sort of vibe to it. And we are finding that in these communities, these community residents have no trouble identifying what culture means, and they know exactly what they want in the areas of art, science, and history. And they want the same things that those people that live in that slice of the pie that have a lot of money want. So here's one of the Northwest blocks. They're interested in public art. They're interested in program training. They like a community choir, African American heritage and development. So that's a key things there. On the east side, they were much more verbose. Diversity, I think, makes a big pitch in all of this across the community, but they're interested in all of the arts. They're interested in science and history as well. They community beautification, programs for children, festivals. They also want to volunteer. We also found that one of the things all of these areas that has happened is that the program is free to all the residents, and the community is saying, well, we want to pay what we can, and so we're now having to negotiate with the county who says we can't charge for having a donate what you can night that gets funded, put back into the programming. And so we're trying to work that out. Mallard Creek, which is up near the university, not a very socioeconomically poor community, but very disconnected in a new community. You can see the things that they want in their community as well. So now to the dashboard as I try and finish up. This is a new report that the board has worked on for several years, and we've been fortunate in this transition to the new ASC over the last couple of years that our board has given us the opportunity to really think things through and to work through things with us. And so when we rolled this out a couple of weeks ago, this has become the new talking point for the community. So it's built from ASC's mission, which is to ensure access to an excellent, relevant, and sustainable cultural community for the Charlotte-Mecklenburg region. And there are 4 major themes under that, as I've said in the mission: access, relevance, excellence, sustainability. We have created outcome metric statements for each of these areas, and then key measures to show how we're doing against those outcome statements. We finalized on 6 sources of data, grantee data that comes to us through the Arts and Science Council, our sort of collection of final reports, the Cultural Life in Mecklenburg County study, the National Center for Arts Research Vibrancy, Creative Vitality Suite, the Public Art Collection data, as well as Arts and Economic Prosperity study. So this first is around the issues of access, and you'll see that not unlike Karen having a map that shows the dots of the locations, that we have one too. This has been a big topic for us this year. We did not know until this year, this is the first year we've collected this data, that almost 800 different street addresses for programs that were funded just by ASC over the last fiscal year. And you can see how they're spread out all across the community. This map is, we're in the process now of converting this infographic to a map that you can click on, and it'll actually take you to the map, and you can see the intensity of the number of days of experience that happen in each of those sites. You can see the barriers to access is one, the numbers of pieces in the public art collection, and then you can see how we're pulling out satisfaction around availability, satisfaction around the cultural experiences close to home. In the relevance area, here we look at the total attendance. I'm probably, one of the things I'm most proud of is that at the ticket where you got 3.1 million attendees in programs funded by ASC last year, that's 1 million more people attending than all of the professional sports games in Charlotte-Mecklenburg combined for the last calendar year. That's a big talking point, especially with economic development people. I'm sure many of you are working on Amazon Headquarter 2 pitches, and our people are using this as well. You can see we ask what people like to see more of. That's coming out of the Cultural Life Survey. Broadway musicals used to be the biggest one. That's come way down. Festivals and culturally diverse programs have moved right up. And I think it's because we're offering more and people are demanding more to see themselves on the stages and gallery walls as well as festivals across the community. Again, from the Cultural Life Survey, satisfaction with program availability and the reflection of the diversity of the community. Excellence, looking at our reputation beyond ourselves, but we are ranked number 20 in the country as the most vibrant large arts communities. We want to see that go up. We know because this data, we're always a year behind on these data sort of because we want to make sure we've collected everything. We know that we dropped down for next year, and so it's going to be interesting to see how we show this and how we go down and others move ahead of us. So you'll have to wait for next September when we roll out next year's. Again, some of our data from the Cultural Life Survey, the total local attendance that was not from Mecklenburg County, so about a third of the people that are coming to our programs are not residents of the community. And then you can see our creative vitality score there in the bottom, that we are 23% above the national average of 1. And then sustainability, looking at the financial health of organizations, what groups are doing a good job or commendable job, but also the ones that are vulnerable. The total support for the sector, we pull that contributed, earned, and government support directly from the audits of the institutions that we provide financial support to. And then this whole issue of building capacity, the full-time jobs in the community, for-profit and nonprofit that come from the creative sector, as well as the number of contact hours we are providing for both individual artists as well as board and staff of nonprofits to build their skills. So if you go down a little further here and we look at one, so that one we looked at a little earlier, the map of all the locations. You know, we hear, like probably all you do, as all of you have heard, that, oh, you just fund the things that take place in the, you know, on the main street. We now have disproved that. And just like Karen's system, we are using an Excel spreadsheet that they submit to us, the street locations, and for every day that they do something in that location, and that goes into a GIS mapping system that the city has provided us free access to the capacity to get that work done. The lesson here is when you, in final reports, you need to ask for data that helps you tell the story that you need to tell elected officials and donors. These numbers are making a difference. Then finally, from the economic impact study, one I think is one of the most important numbers in that study, and it sort of it's not one of the big numbers that they throw out when they're talking about the economic impact study from AFTA, but that 84% of our non-resident attendees said that they would have traveled to a different community for the event if it wasn't here. That means that they're coming here because the event is here. And that we also know that our visitors spend about 100% more than residents in addition to the price of admission. And so my lessons learned here and looking at the data is don't always look at the obvious, look deep into the data that you're receiving and make sure you're using the right stories that can be told from that data. So with that, I will step back and we'll start answering questions, and I'll invite, I think Patricia is going to sort of help us get through that process.
Wonderful. Thank you, Robert. And thank you, Karen. Really, the two of you gave both very impressive presentations that really dive deep into how your two agencies are utilizing data and evidence. And at this point, I'm going to make a call out to our participants online. You are more than welcome to submit questions to either Robert or Karen or collectively to both of them. And while we're waiting for some of those questions to come on board, I had a few questions and comments, but I'm going to throw out a question first to both of you. Karen in particular, Karen, you had pointed out in your presentation that your agency has two primary stakeholder groups, the public, the residents of your community, and arts organizations. And as I listened to both of your presentations today, there was clearly a strong focus on how do we engage our residents within our community. So I'm curious to hear what the response has been of arts organizations in your regions, both to the added data collection burden, but also how are they responding to just this increased information about the public and what the public wants. And Robert, if you would like to take this question first, and then Karen, you can follow.
Okay. So we, as you can imagine, our sort of benefit there is similar. We actually put the residents as our primary audience and the cultural organizations as the secondary audience. And we've been doing that since 2008. That has become easier for the groups to swallow over time, but it was a real sort of fight at the beginning when our board came to that decision that we were here to serve the residents of this community first. And so that has been an interesting process, but over time they have come better. The data collection, there's always some grousing around that, but they have actually, because we're sharing all this data and they're starting to see how this data is reframing the entire sector story and the advocacy for the entire sector story, they're not as, they don't complain as much. I also admit that I don't hear all of the complaining because I don't deal with all of the reminders for final reports, but they've gotten better over the year. Breaking it down into asking for it quarterly has helped, and providing them with this simple Excel sheet that they can fill out, especially for that program location data. The biggest hurdle we had with the first year of that was making sure everybody was on the same page of understanding what we were asking them to count. Probably the big aha was the date that we showed them the first map after the first quarter, and we could run the cursor across the map and they could see their name popping up as you hit those little dots. And we had not asked them about sharing that level of detail with each other before, and all of a sudden they were like, well, sure, you can share this with anybody you want to, because they see that it's helping them break out of their sort of central institution and being seen as serving the entire community.
Thank you, Robert, very much. Karen, would you like to comment on this question as well about the response of arts organizations to these changes?
Sorry, there's a delay on my mute button. I apologize. Yeah, similar to Robert, when you change the focus, and again, like Robert, we're primarily a grant maker here. I think Robert has a slightly larger scope of work than we do, but the primary work of our local arts agency really falls into the grant-making bucket. When we started talking about serving residents as well as serving organizations, there certainly was some conversation from organizations saying, well, but you serve residents through us. So, because, our audiences are the residents, so why would you need to have a bigger conversation than just the audiences that participate in our programs? And over time, I think folks are coming to see that as we collect more information from area residents who may absolutely believe in arts and culture as a driver of our economy and as a key element of our quality of life, but who don't actually intend to go visit some of our cultural institutions, when we get that kind of information, we can dig deeper on it and figure out why that is and hopefully provide data back to organizations that helps them in their own marketing and engagement strategies. So one way we think about that, Patricia, is that whenever we do surveys, whenever we collect information, when we do our statistically significant phone polling, we try to bring our organizations together and share what we've learned. Robert's data about where people get their information about the arts, for example, that stuff is really important to cultural institutions to know, and if we've spent money to collect it, we can share it back out. And so that's one way that we help our cultural organizations understand why we might care about a resident-facing focus. But also on this question of equity that we're beginning to deal with here in Cuyahoga County, as we heard from the residents of our community that there was a concern, especially around racial equity, that we weren't necessarily serving all of the community in an equitable way, it becomes very easy for cultural organizations to say, but wait, we're already doing X and Y and Z programs to address that very issue. And so we've tried to be active in sitting down with organizations and asking them a terrific question that came from our friend Holly Sidford, which is not, what are you doing to address equity, but what are you doing that you're most proud of to address a more equitable way of reaching the public? And as we asked that question, it really animated organizations to tell us what they're excited about and also tell us what they're concerned about. We had one organization say, we really want to do a better job at this, and we're not sure what the best way is for us to measure the change in the demography of our audience. Can you help us figure out how to do that? So by bringing that information to them in that way and asking for their input, it also keeps them bought into the process. The last thing I'll say, though, about our resident focus is actually something that can help organizations on the marketing communications side. One of the things we do here, like I'm sure many of you, is we established a community arts calendar. It's called clevelandartsevents.com. And for when we poll residents, one of the things they say they want us to do is provide them with more information about what's happening in the community. So knowing that residents have said they want that, we can talk to all of our cultural partners, which is what we call our grantees, and ask them to tell us what they're doing, get it up on our arts calendar, and then blast that out to the public in lots of different ways so that there are more and more opportunities for more and more people to see the work of our cultural partners. So all of that together helps that shift in focus make more sense, I think, to everyone.
Thank you, Karen. And Karen and Robert, we have questions coming in from the audience. So I'm going to ask a question from Deanna Zachary. She asked, how are you changing your grant making based on your new data about what residents really want? Robert, could you take that question first?
Well, a primary way we have done that is, like many of you, we use our project grant funding, used to accept any kind of project, art, science, or history that met the criteria, and whatever the group or individual artists wanted to propose that we do. With all of this data that we're collecting and how it informs our planning, we have changed that to our project grant program is now centered on the goals that the community identified in our most recent cultural action plan. And the two big goals there being, one, build community. The community said back to us, and we were surprised at how strong this response was, that the community said, we want the cultural sector to be the bridge builder across difference that the platform you provide with programming on stages and in exhibition spaces and in classrooms actually is the best way for us to learn about each other and to bridge difference. So build community being the big theme there. The second is innovative and relevant programming for a rapidly changing population. Our population is shifting very quickly. The city is already majority minority, which I think is the stupidest term ever, but we got to figure out a better way of saying that that whole sort of thing. But we want to make sure that the programming that is reflected on the stages and in the exhibition halls reflects the population of this community, because long term that means that the groups that have been the sort of major powerhouses have got to reflect those other populations, or they're going to continue to lose audiences as their sort of share of the audience in the population goes down. So we're now funding projects that actually have to speak to those big areas. Even festivals have to connect into that bridge building community area or innovation and relevance area. And we're attracting a whole lot of new applicants in that category or that program than we've ever had before, because I think it's because for the first time project grants mean something. We also up the level of money we give. We also will give money over 2 years for a project because we see that these are things that have to be built on. The other thing is that to better reflect the diversity of the population, we've opened up our operating support to a whole new category of groups, and the majority of those new groups that have come in, 13 in the last 2 years, are African American, Latin American, LBGT-based organizations, and that has had a huge impact on the change of the makeup of those groups that are getting unrestricted operating support. And that came because our board said if it was important for these big old Western European institutions have been getting money since 1958 to have unrestricted operating support, why aren't we giving it to the groups that in 10 or 15 or 20 years are going to be the major institutions in this community?
Thank you, Robert. And Karen, would you care to also respond to that question?
Absolutely. And I think in a lot of ways we aspire to some of what Robert and the folks in Charlotte have already achieved. So I think you heard some really good things from Robert on the data they're collecting and how that's beginning to influence some things. We might be a little bit earlier in the work here in Cleveland as a younger agency, but I will say that we are directly in response to what we've heard, trying to simplify some of our grant processes so that more organizations and more artists can participate in our funding. And in fact, with some help from the NEA this summer, we piloted a new way of doing some grant making to help enliven a public space, our new public square, which was redone in time for the Republican National Convention last summer. We wanted to experiment with ways to bring different kinds of artists and organizations in to activate the space. And so we used a simpler process, a simple grant form, a panel process that was really a conversation around a table with a bias toward trying to fund something as opposed to trying to not fund something. And we were very pleased to see the different kinds of organizations that responded, the different kinds of artists who responded, and the ways we were able to connect with people slightly differently than we had before. We also have right now a group, our Support for Artists planning team is working, and their work is really going to influence, I think, how our grant making shifts in the future. We have traditionally funded artists here through an intermediary, and we've decided to change up how that process works. And so we've invited a group of 13 working artists. The group is a majority people of color, to really come together and wrestle with questions of not only what support for artists looks like, but how we do that in an equitable way, how we take race and class and equity into account as we do that grant making. They're going to make recommendations to us at the end of this calendar year, and I fully expect that some of the recommendations we hear about ways we can support artists will also be things that we need to weave through our project support and our operating support grant programs over time. We want to be very mindful, as I know Robert does. You don't want to destabilize organizations by shifting big priorities year after year after year. But this question for us around equity is something that we need to really think about and address carefully, and think about ways that we can provide support to organizations and to artists who are doing that work differently. So a little bit of our answer is stay tuned. But we will certainly be learning from our friends in Charlotte and from friends around the country who are also doing this work.
Great. Thank you both. And we do have a lot of questions rolling in, so I thank everybody on the webinar for contributing thoughts and comments and questions. This one is coming from Jenny Cole, and she asks about what are your expectations for dissemination of results from various project activities that you've funded? So again, what are your expectations for dissemination of results from various project activities that you've funded? And one example that she provided, for instance, was an exhibit at a local art gallery. And Karen, would you like to respond first?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure I understand the question. So here's the question I'm going to answer. I think, Jenny, you're asking, when you get information back from organizations who have done work, how do you share what they've learned? So let me talk about that. And if I didn't get that right, I hope you will clarify your question in the chat box, and we'll try again. For us, and hopefully this is, I'm sure this is practice in your organizations if you're coming from a local arts agency. If you're coming from a nonprofit organization and you're listening in, I'm sure there's often a question of, gosh, when I fill out those reports, does anyone actually read them? And I think you heard from Robert, and you'll hear from me, that in fact we do read them, and we do take what you tell us and try to use it to connect either organizations with resources, to tell stories about what's going on, to not just make something that happened at one organization happen in one place, but rather share that information more broadly. So we try to model that ourselves whenever we do research, whenever we take on data or information. As I said before, we convene the cultural community and share it. We make it all available on our website. It's all very transparent and easy to find. We do a lot of social media around it. But the same thing goes when we are looking at reports and understanding what organizations are doing. That one of our values at CAC is connection. We know that as a funder, we often are connected to more people, and we can see all those things that are happening in a similar space in a way that sometimes others don't have that ability to see. And so we try very hard to connect good work with other folks in the field who are trying to do good work and make sure that those stories that people tell us, the results that people get as they do the work of trying to diversify audiences. We heard a story from a large cultural institution here lamenting a little bit the fact that a day that was traditionally a free day in the organization turned into a day where, rather than seeing the neighbors to the institution who were coming from communities of color and communities of high poverty, on free day at the museum, it tended to be families from the suburbs who knew it was free day. And they took on an intentional strategy for inviting their neighbors to come to their free day, and lo and behold, their neighbors showed up. And so now they need to find a better way to track who came and share those results with others. And even the act of me telling you all of this on a webinar, for us putting that in a blog, for us talking about that in our newsletters, helps take that one instance of a change effort that's afoot in a large institution and then share it out with the broader public. So I hope that gets at some of the questions.
And I can actually build on that specific example. Our major science museum here had been very resistant to having free access days unless somebody was paying for the lost revenue from admission. However, they have a new leader who has brought them to the point of instituting a policy where any family that has a WIC card or a EBT card, which is the equivalent of food stamp card here in Mecklenburg County, can get admission for a family of 4 for $1, and they are now giving away the equivalent of $1 million a year in admissions to people who come and pay $1 to come in. It's about 10% of their total attendance is now coming in those. But it's a very different proposition. People come any day of the year when they can come. They are paying something, so there is a value to it, but they also are becoming repeat visitors. So that's an example there. We do many of the same things. We've gotten much better, I think, at sharing the qualitative part of the storytelling through our social media and focusing on reports from grantees. But when you're having to, so much of my job, and I think many of yours, is dealing with either elected officials or donors to convince them of the importance of the the support that they provide us to give to the community. You've got to be fairly succinct and to the point, and you can't go into a lot of deep stories. But I use Randy Cohen from Americans for the Arts mantra of no number without a story, no story without a number. And so having these numbers to be able to tell these stories is important. So now that I have that number, that we have 1 million more participants in the things that the Arts Council funds than all the professional sports tickets sold in the community. People's faces get bright and they're like, now there. So very simple story, but it shows the impact of the entire sector.
Thank you both for those very rich answers. We're going to take one last question, or I'll share with you one last question, and this is from Dale Cronkite. His question is, are results of your arts programs and art data collection activities discoverable, searchable, and linkable by expanding public art data into linked open data standards? That's quite a question. And I'm going to combine it with another question we received, which is about whether or not either of you make your instruments, your data collection instruments that you have made within your own organizations available and accessible to the public. So really the question here is about what are you sharing with the larger community, both in terms of data that you've collected as well as instruments that you've used for collection.
I can start there. Actually, I think I answered that sort of a little bit online in the question response, but we have tended not to put the questionnaire out there for the public opinion survey or many of the forms that the grantees have to fill out are not available to the public, but we do make those available to our peers. So if anybody wants to ask me to have a copy of the survey instrument or, data collection tools, I'd be happy to share those with you individually. That broader question that you started with about data, public art data into linked open data standards, that's a great goal. We've just finally gotten to the point of having data to put out there has been a huge task, and I hadn't tackled that one, but now you've got it on my list of how do we make it much more broadly available. I will say that the scorecard that you saw, the dashboard, is now available on our website, as well as all of the economic impact information. And so we are trying to, for the very first time, make very broadly available the results of the study. And we'll continue to look at how do we share that much more broadly in the future on open data platforms.
Yeah, it is a great question about open data, and it's a subject that I know is dear to the heart of lots of folks who work in this field. We're probably where Robert is on that. It's like, that is a good question, and we should be thinking about it perhaps a little bit differently than Robert. We are, with the exception of the statistical phone survey polls, which are created by a third-party organization, it is a little bit proprietary. We do share as much of the instrument, especially we did in our Cuyahoga Voices and Vision project, the organizational planning work that I referenced. If you look at future.cacgrants.org, you will find there the data as well as the narratives, as well as the stories, et cetera, et cetera. And we do make a point of trying to put as much of that out into the public as we can. Part of that's being a government agency, right? I mean, everything we do here is subject to public scrutiny. We are subject to sunshine laws here, so we may as well create data that we can share. This question of how to share it through open data standards and all of that is a little bit above my pay grade when it comes to the technology part of that, but I understand the crux of the question, and I think it's certainly something that we aspire to.
Thank you both. And I just wanted to highlight for our listeners as well that the NEA does support the National Archive of Data on Arts and Culture. I encourage you to do a Google search for that, pull it up. It actually right now holds 271 data sets related to the arts and is really a good source of data if you're interested in doing further analysis on any range of arts-related research topics. So again, I'd like to thank Karen and Robert for generously sharing their time, not just today, but in preparatory discussions that led up to the webinar today. And I'd like to thank you on the line for joining us today. If you take a look at the final page I'm going to pull up, you'll actually see there the URL where this webinar will be archived, and I know we usually try to get it up within a few days, so if you check back next week, you're welcome to take a look at this archived webinar, share it with your friends, and I also encourage you to keep an eye open on our webinar page for upcoming events. We will be holding another webinar in October, and the focus will be looking at performance measurement and evaluation in state arts agencies and regional arts organizations. So I encourage you to come back and listen in again. So thank you for joining us, and have a good day.